Psychopath, narcissist, sadist. These are words used to describe some of the most infamous figures in true crime. But what do they actually mean? And how do they come into play in a courtroom? We're talking the dark intersection between mental health and violent crime. From Ted Bundy to Bryan Kohberger to BTK to Luigi Mangione. Different names, but familiar patterns. Welcome to Character Analysis, the podcast where I play armchair psychiatrist and internet detective to try and figure out why people do some of the crazy, ridiculous, and sometimes disturbing things that they do. Today, we have an actual psychiatrist with us, Dr. Ziv Cohen. Ziv, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm Ziv Cohen. I am a psychiatrist and a forensic psychiatrist. I'm the founder and medical director of a practice called Principium Psychiatry, and
Hmm.
that's a cutting edge, multi state practice where we do really innovative things like ketamine therapy and transcranial magnetic stimulation. And we really focus on treating depression and anxiety. Another side of my work is that I'm a forensic psychiatrist for many years, have been active in teaching and researching in this area. And I maintain an active caseload of forensic psychiatry cases that can be anything from serving as an expert witness in a medical malpractice case, but it also involves being an expert witness in homicide cases and types of cases where people are making mental health defenses, for example,
Hmm.
like the insanity defense or extreme emotional disturbance. I'm essentially retained for cases. So if I'm profiling, which I do, it's more in the sense of evaluating this individual and providing an analysis of this person.
When it comes to the Luigi Mangione case, what were your initial thoughts of him?
Before I dive in, a little disclaimer, which is as a forensic psychiatrist, I have to be careful not to diagnose people
Right.
that I haven't been hired to
Mhm.
assess. You
Mhm.
know, in forensic ethics, it's a little complicated because normally psychiatrists will not diagnose someone unless they've met them clinically.
Right.
We don't really observe that rule in forensic psychiatry and our ethics because sometimes we evaluate people who we can't meet. For example, profiling. Sometimes you have to profile someone that you're never going to meet. You might not meet them because they're not available to be evaluated. You might not meet them because they're deceased. So,
Mhm.
for example, I do things like psychological autopsies where I
Mm.
have to evaluate somebody who committed a crime and I can't meet the person and they're not available. And so we're ethically allowed to render opinions purely based on evidence. All that having been said, what I'm going to talk about today is pattern recognition. And I'm going to talk about possibilities and how
Mhm.
forensic psychiatrists think. When I heard about the case, I thought about a number of possibilities. And, this is what forensic psychiatrists do. So we go through what we call in medicine a differential diagnosis. So, in any type of patient or in a forensic case, it's not about finding the needle in the haystack, what is the answer? It's more about process. What are the possibilities and how do I rule them out? We want to doubt our own intuitions and make sure that we're rigorous in how we approach things because you can become overly invested in a theory, which for whatever reason you care about, and
Mhm.
that can blind you to objectivity. So with Luigi Mangione, he was the chief suspect for the crime and he was arrested for it. And there was some surveillance footage and we all saw the shooting because there was videotaped. So the shooting appeared clearly deliberate. There was no altercation. There was no conflict. Essentially, someone was gunned down in the street who was unaware. He was sort of blissfully going about his morning, and he was caught by surprise and shot by someone who specifically seemed to target him,
Mhm.
surveil him, and target him. So, one of the things you're thinking about as a forensic psychiatrist is what is the mental state of the perpetrator? Oh, again, we don't know whether it was Luigi Mangione or not. Regardless of who it was, what does that tell us about his mental state? And, so one of the things is that the person appears cool, calm, and collected. If the person appears cool, calm, and collected, then you're already thinking, this is going to be hard to think of as a crime of passion. This looks, from a legal perspective, more like murder, which the law defines as malice aforethought. So you planned it, you intended it, and you did it with malice. So that's kind of what you're thinking about when you see that video. What are the possibilities though? If he appears calm and collected, who would do something like that? So I'm not now thinking of somebody with an impulse control disorder.
Right.
I'm not thinking about someone who flies into a rage, who doesn't plan, who is a loose cannon. I'm not thinking about that type of person. One thing that we always think about in forensic psychiatry is personality. The prototype of the criminal in my world is the psychopath. The thing about psychopathy, though, that doesn't totally fit that video, I won't even say it doesn't fit Luigi Mangione. I'll just say it doesn't fit the video, is that the video and kind of what else we've heard about the case appears to sort of document an encounter between strangers. Psychopaths kill for personal gain. They don't kill for symbolic or political reasons. They just don't. I mean, that's not what they do. And the reason is that psychopaths don't really have a moral code. So they're
Right.
not invested in an ideology. It could be thought of to some degree as a total breakdown in their moral system, but it's
Mhm.
not really what we think about in terms of psychopathy, which is someone
Mhm.
who has a clinical disorder where they're unemotional, they can't develop connections or bonds, they don't really have any moral system. They view people as objects, as tools. They don't really
Mhm.
see them as having any intrinsic value. So there's no reason not to exploit them or hurt them or to do whatever you want with them. So that's the psychopath. But so typically they're treating a person as an object, as a tool. And so they kill for gain. Sometimes it's just for pleasure. So you have sexual sadists.
Mm.
So that would be like Jack the Ripper, Ted Bundy. So these are people who could commit heinous sexualized violence. The BTK killer. Are you
Mhm.
familiar with the BTK killer?
Very much. Yeah.
If I recall, he didn't even sexually assault his victims, but it was
Right.
sexualized killing. They would be naked, or he would strip them down, and so it was very sexualized. But the pleasure was in the sadism. It wasn't really
Mhm.
in the sex.
Right.
So sometimes psychopaths kill for pleasure, not for monetary gain or to get somebody out of the way. But the point is, they're getting something out of it. And when you look
Mhm.
at that video, it's a little bit hard to understand what this person would be getting out of it. Once we realize that the suspect has been identified, leading suspect has been identified as Luigi Mangione, and what we know about him, it again becomes hard to figure what would he be getting out of this. He didn't rob this person. They weren't known to each other. They had never. It's not like this person had crossed Luigi Mangione. To my knowledge, it's not even clear that United really was involved in anything related to his care. Because I
Yeah,
know there's been
nothing.
okay.
They found no connection.
Because I know he had this back pain issue.
Mm.
So people were speculating maybe he was angry that United denied him care, but that doesn't. So I think that psychopathy doesn't really fit this type of pattern. So we kind of thought, okay, it's not some wild, impulsive person. It's not a psychopath, at least from terms of pattern recognition. Could it be someone who's psychotic? By psychosis, we think about a person with schizophrenia, but there's other mental illnesses that can lead to psychosis. And we think of psychosis as somebody who's lost touch with reality. They have hallucinations, delusions. A psychotic patient would be, for example, or a psychotic defendant would be, for example, somebody who thinks that they're being followed by the police. And they're not, and they have no criminal history, but they think they're being followed everywhere they go. They start hearing voices. Maybe they think the voices are the police talking to them and telling them how they're going to catch them or hurt them. And they think the voices are real. And then maybe they act out and they shoot a police officer.
Mhm.
That would sort of be an example of a psychotic defendant. Did the defendant here have a delusion about United Healthcare? Some kind of delusional system that United Healthcare was surveilling him or harming him or doing something to him or harming others. That's definitely a question. I think I would be very interested in that if I
Mhm.
was evaluating him. One way we think about that is we talk about reality testing, kind of investigating in the examination his reality testing. To what extent does he have fixed false beliefs, delusions about important topics that might touch on this case, and I don't think we have any information on that one way or another. If he's been examined by psychiatrists, it's all highly confidential, and but we would hear about it at trial.
I sent you a number of pieces written who we believe by Luigi.
Yeah. So it kind of touches on the broader issue of, killers who have left behind written reflections prior to the crime. And we could think of many people who have done this. You could think about the Unabomber who would, send letters, manifestos. What you find in a lot of these folks who write these manifestos is grandiosity. So they feel that they are chosen. They have a special insight, which
Mhm.
nobody else has, and then they're chosen to address the problem.
Yes.
And then what's also interesting is that there's this kind of short circuit because they go from, I have a special insight and I'm chosen to deal with a problem, to this kind of short circuit to, and the way to deal with the problem is with some extreme violence. They usually don't really detail why that is the case. How do you get from A to B? How is this violence really going to solve the issue? And so from a psychiatric perspective, I would say, these are folks who are rationalizing a drive to hurt people.
In a case like this, let's talk general, hypothetical, not necessarily specifically. Based on the writing and what you see, do you think a lawyer in this situation would have any kind of EED defense or any sort of mental distress defense? He's just left behind so much writing. Oh my god, dude, shut up. He just spoke. He just wouldn't stop talking and stop writing. He put everything in writing. Could a lawyer take information like that and use that as emotional distress?
So, y- so it really depends to a large extent on the jurisdiction. So I'll start with New York. So in New York is a state that does not have a defense of diminished capacity. Diminished capacity is a legal concept which says if the individual had some kind of a mental disorder or even mental distress, it doesn't have to be a full-blown disorder, that may have clouded their judgment,
Mhm.
then you can use that as a defense. The defendant can claim diminished capacity. And what diminished capacity will accomplish from a legal perspective is you cannot convict them of murder. It
Mhm.
will bring them down to manslaughter, which makes a big difference because it may mean that they can't receive the death penalty, or it may mean that they're going to have a much shorter sentence. So in New York, we don't have that. In New York, we have extreme emotional disturbance. It's a different legal concept. In EED, the idea is that a crime of passion. So the typical example, which is kind of dated now and chauvinistic, but the classic example is a man walks in on his wife having sex with somebody else and he
Mhm.
shoots them both on the spot. That's what you think of classically as a crime of passions. And the idea is there that so the law would say, or could say, a jury could find, they don't have to, but they could find, looking at all the evidence, that this person labored under an extreme emotional disturbance. It was not murder because it was a product of an extreme emotional disturbance, and therefore it's manslaughter. Now, the reason I call that conservative, not in a political but in a legal sense, is that it's harder to prove EED than diminished capacity. Diminished capacity is very elastic, but EED is very specific. So, what are some of the things that we look at? There has to be a trigger. You can't
Right.
just go and shoot someone and say, "Yeah, I've been depressed for the last month. That's my extreme emotional disturbance." No, the law in New York, especially the case law says there has to be a trigger. Sometimes there's a debate. Does it have to be a physical trigger, like push someone pushing you in a bar, or is a verbal trigger enough? Like if somebody
Mm.
says, "I'm going to have sex with your girlfriend," does that count as a trigger? So in New York, yes. And in most states, yes. Even a verbal trigger could be used, and then the
Right.
crime has to happen relatively quickly after that.
Right.
What's
Mhm.
really essential is the trigger and the proximity of the crime to the trigger. Also, courts like to see that there's a loss of control,
Mhm.
which can seem a little bit confusing. But for example, there's a famous case in New York, one of the important cases on EED. A man was depressed at home,
Mhm.
was having business problems, stressed out, and his girlfriend was insisting on having a dinner party. And he asked her to cancel it, and she said to him, "What are you, crazy?" Everyone's planning on coming. And he lost control and he beat her to death with a baseball bat so severely that she was essentially decapitated. So he was found to have an extreme emotional disturbance because it was well documented that he was under treatment for depression. It was felt that that verbal statement, "Are you crazy?" was a sufficient trigger. And then he immediately lost control and killed her. So there was proximity between the trigger and the crime. And also, the crime evidenced a complete loss of control. The crime itself showed that this man was in a frenzy. So even though we might think, well, that's a very brutal crime, why would that be considered something that reduces his culpability? But actually, from an EED perspective, it fits the pattern. And so it actually supports the EED conclusion. So now applying that to what we saw in the video of the assassination of the United Healthcare executive, there's no words exchanged. There's no physical altercation. It appears calm and deliberate. And right, there's no frenzy. There's nothing that would indicate loss of control during the killing. In fact, it's very
Mhm,
deliberate. So in New York, Luigi Mangione, he has no diminished capacity option. The only option
mhm.
he has is EED, and it looks like a stretch based on the video.
What if what if they determine that there were untreated mental health issues? How does that could that factor in?
In New York, there's not much option to, in state court, there's not much option to factor it in other than EED and other than the insanity defense.
Yeah.
So he could go for the full-blown insanity defense. With the insanity defense, the person is making the argument that they didn't know right from wrong, or they literally didn't even know what they were doing. That's really the standard in most jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions have a broader standard, which is you couldn't control yourself. So you knew it was wrong, but you couldn't control yourself. It kind of opens the door for someone to say it was irresistible. A
Mm.
famous example of that is the Hinckley case. He
Oh,
shot
yeah.
Ronald Reagan. So a lot of people were upset that he received the insanity verdict because he didn't really seem insane to a lot of people. He didn't seem
Mhm,
that sick, that mentally ill. But one of the things he was able to argue was that he had an irresistible impulse,
mhm,
that he just felt like he couldn't resist it. And he had a really well known psychiatrist who testified on his behalf, Dr. Carpenter, who was a world expert on schizophrenia. And he really talked about this idea that, once you get in the mindset of doing something, you can't turn back, you lose control. So, lay people don't usually like that
mhm,
concept. It opens the door to make this defense viable for many more defendants. In New
mhm.
York, we have the cognitive test of insanity, which is not knowing the nature and consequences of your actions or not knowing that they're wrong. So you
Right.
can't say, I couldn't control myself. It really is down to what did you know? What did you understand about what you were doing?
This is where I wonder if the journal that Luigi kept with the entries about United Healthcare, this I wonder how these are going to come into play and whether or not they're going to be used against him because he talks about United Healthcare in these entries. He talks about his plan without ever saying it explicitly about what he's going to do, but he does say, "I no longer wonder if this is right or just." So he's demonstrating that he knows this might not be the right thing to do, and he's gonna do it anyway.
Typically, writings like that that
Mhm,
indicate a motivation and an ideology and a plan and that do not have anything delusional in them. Like the writings could be helpful if the writing says, he's sending me messages and he's making me sick and I only way I can survive is if I eliminate him. That sounds pretty ill, mentally ill, and could help in insanity defense. But if there's an absence of that, other things that can help in writings is if the writing is very disorganized.
mm,
Seems crazy scribbles. But these writings, if you look at them, it's very clean page. There's not a lot of crossing out. The thoughts are cogent. So typically, an organized document with an absence of psychotic material is going to hurt an insanity defense. I think for mental health, without knowing more, it seems like it's going to be a tough pathway uh,
yeah, I agree.
for
Yeah,
this case. And then, of course, but I think you're also raising also other question, which is separate from legal defense. Of course, we all are interested. Why would a person do something like this? And that's
right.
still forensic psychiatry. The law has buckets for how they categorize people
Mhm,
from a criminal justice perspective. But that doesn't change the fact that we want to know, why do people behave the way they do from a
Right.
scientific perspective.
Now you said we still want to know why. In my initial email when we were going over topics, uh, I did bring up Bryan Kohberger of the Idaho case,
Right.
and there's no known motive, and people are really struggling with no tangible motive, not something they can't point to, and they don't seem to understand that the motive just needs to be personal to them. It doesn't they don't need to have a personal connection to the victims. When there is no tangible motive, what does that say about the case? What does that say about the perpetrator?
When you have a crime that doesn't seem to benefit the criminal, so you don't have a clear motive. Let me be more specific. When you have a homicide or a home invasion and a homicide and a very brutal close quarter homicide using a knife. There's nothing
Mm,
sterile or surgical about this. This was wanting to be up close and bloody. When you have a crime like that and you have no clear motive for the person who was convicted of the crime, then I think you are going to start thinking about psychosis. Was there some kind of a delusion, some belief that there was some danger in the house? But again, psychotic individuals don't typically mass murder. They don't go and stab 4 people in a house. It's more about 1 person, so that's a little odd. In a home invasion like this, killing strangers, multiple strangers, it doesn't really fit the pattern of psychosis for the most part. I can't think of a case now off the top of my head that goes with that. But I
mhm,
think you're going more on personality, and when there's no gain that the person's getting, you're thinking about somebody who just maybe enjoys killing or fantasizes about killing, and I
mhm,
think that kind of pattern makes you think more about psychopathy, is basically so I can't, diagnose anything about Bryan Kohberger, but if a law enforcement or a lawyer calls me and says, "Here's a fact pattern, what does it make you think of?" As a forensic psychiatrist, I would say psychopathy. I'm thinking about Jack the Ripper, the BTK killer, and what's also interesting about Bryan Kohberger, I just wanna add, is that he was studying criminal justice or criminology, and he had even studied with an expert on serial killers. He had had a mentor, I think in his
Ramsland.
undergrad.
Yeah, Ramsland.
So you start to wonder, could you have a person who's very interested in this personally, fantasizes about it, struggles with it, tries to cope with it by pursuing a more academic pursuit,
Mhm.
but over time is no longer able to control those fantasies, those urges?
I learned something that I didn't know last week, which was that BTK was studying criminal justice and criminology. And after his first murder, he was in class while they were talking about this murder, identical to Kohberger. And the similarities between the BTK and Ted Bundy and the Chi Omega murders, to me, he seemed like somebody who was truly not, I don't know if the word's obsessed, but he was I feel he was emulating these people. Now, his lawyer did not want him to be assessed, and they didn't want it brought into trial. Do you think that had to do with her concern that he might be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder?
Yeah, I do think that that's a very high likelihood. I think that if an attorney, and we have no idea if he has any diagnosis and can't speculate on it, but I think just if an attorney doesn't want their criminal defendant examined psychiatrically, it makes me think about 2 possibilities, because generally criminal defendants wanna be examined psychiatrically because they have a sense that that could help their case. So, it makes me think about 2 possibilities. One is that sometimes you have a very psychotic person who's convinced that they're normal and everyone else is crazy, and they won't cooperate with their lawyer, even though it'll save their life. They just will refuse to see a psychiatrist. Sometimes you have a very grandiose person who will do the same thing. For example, the Unabomber. He was examined by a psychiatrist, but he refused to pursue the insanity defense. He didn't want to be considered insane. That was
Mhm,
very important to him. So there's a certain ego. There could also be ego involved. And then I think you're raising another possibility, which is the lawyer. If the lawyer doesn't want it, it's not the defendant who's refusing, but the lawyer doesn't want it, then maybe they're thinking it's going to show their client in an unfavorable light and reveal things that they don't want revealed. For example, when someone commits a crime like this, I would usually think that there were precursors. So you want to know, was there cruelty to animals? Sometimes serial killers like Ted Bundy would do this. They'll kill dogs or cats in very cruel ways. They start to test things out. There may have been other times where he surveilled people. BTK was big for this. Big BTK do a lot of surveillance on many different potential victims before he finally picked one, before he
Mm.
psychologically crossed that threshold where he was really ready to commit the crime. One possible motive, and again, just in terms of the differential, not saying anything about this particular case,
Right. Right.
one possible motive is if the person is a psychopath, that they just take pleasure in this, or they just have persistent fantasies that they can't control. They're just thinking about it obsessively. Like BTK, he's an interesting example because he shared a lot. A lot of psychopaths don't want to let you into their inner world. Like Ted Bundy was like that. He just wouldn't let people into his world. And we can speculate why. I think a lot of people think that, he knows that if people can peek into his world, they're going to think he's a monster.
Right.
And he just doesn't want that. Jeffrey Dahmer also let people to a large extent into his world. He talked about his urges, feeling like he couldn't control them.
Mhm.
So BTK, Jeffrey Dahmer. But BTK, he wrote very detailed journals and he said that he had these sexual sadist fantasies, from the time he was like 12. He would see women and he would fantasize about binding them and torturing them. And then at some point in adulthood, he really just, you know, crossed into living these fantasies. So that's something that you would think about in a case like this, just going into a dorm room and stabbing a bunch of young people, stabbing women in a bloody way, that there's some potential sexual sadism, just psychopathic fantasies that are motivating that.
Yeah, I have a feeling that's one. I think I don't think we're ever gonna know. I think it's gonna be a while before he talks, but this mystery around it, I think, is thrilling for him. The less he says, the more people speculate and talk and theorize, and the online culture. Are you aware of any of the online culture when it comes to really either of these cases, and how passionate some people are about these two men's innocence? Have you heard anything about it?
I mean, I have for sure, and I think that's a fascinating topic. Is sort of fans of criminals or people who are fan clubs that form around violent criminals or violent men,
Mhm,
um, or potentially violent men. So one thing that I like to talk about is that serial killers typically have a fan club, and a lot of the fan club is actually females, and they can get love letters from women who profess their love, who want to marry them. And people have puzzled over this. So I think that sort of, you think about Luigi Mangione in that respect. Of course, we don't know if he's guilty or innocent, but the attraction to this person, and of course, there are circumstances that can feed into that. He's a handsome guy, right? I mean, I think most people would say he kind of has model looks, so that doesn't hurt his case. But I think that the fact that he's accused of violence is part of the appeal. So
mhm,
it's expressed as, oh, he's innocent, but really the appeal is that deep down the person knows they're accused of a serious violent crime, of shooting somebody. People have speculated this may have something to do with evolution. So if you look at primates, primate cultures are structured around alpha males,
mhm,
and alpha males are really just the most violent person in the room. That's what
mm,
they are. Today we think, CEO is an alpha male or something like that, but really in primate terms, it's the person who can get really violent really fast, so you don't cross them. And I think that female primates fall in line around the alpha male. That's how
mhm,
that's the hierarchy of the culture. So you just wonder whether there's some echoes of that. It's not conscious, but there's some
right,
echoes of that for some women. It's obviously a very small minority of human primates that have this fascination, but it's a significant minority, and we see it over and over again. And so it does make you think whether there's some evolutionary echo in our genes that go back millions of years in primate evolution.
mhm,
There's some appeal there to a violent, dangerous man. I also think that on a fantasy level, it works because they can profess their love, but they know they'll never actually be able to be with this person.
right,
So you can kind of play that game of flirting with danger,
Right,
proximity, but knowing that you're actually protected because the person's in custody. So I think that
right.
also has a fascination.
Well, we do as a society, we tend to it's the halo effect. We tend to assign positive traits to people who are conventionally attractive.
Right.
We're
That's
just sort
true.
of wired to do that. I do wonder if Luigi didn't look the way he looked, where would this case be? Would he have $1,000,000 in a defense fund? Probably not.
Right.
Probably not. I still
Sure.
think he would have support, but yeah, I think his looks have a lot to do with it.
I would
Uh,
agree with that. I think if you look at Ted Bundy, for example, he was also a handsome guy. And so that may have played into it. So I agree. And then there's also this nexus between narcissism and your
mhm.
appearance. So you often find people who are attractive are narcissistic. So if we're thinking about not Luigi Mangione, but if we're just thinking about defendants who are grandiose and think they're special, and they may often also be attractive. They may be used to being noticed because of how they look, and that feeds into that narcissism.
I do wonder how narcissism could play a role in either case. Is there, because we all have narcissistic traits, we need them to get by, to build confidence, to go to do certain things. But I do wonder with Kohberger, everybody said that he had to be the smartest person in the room and his entire identity was around being a criminal, being in this program and being smarter than everybody. And I do wonder, was there any narcissism at play? Can you speak generally about narcissism like Bundy?
You're touching on a really important point, which is that so we talked about how psychopaths are the hard edge of antisocial personality, the worst cases of antisocial personality. Another way to think about psychopaths is that they're at the ultimate extreme of narcissism.
Okay.
Narcissists The more narcissistic you get, the more likely you are to have some antisocial traits because you think that you don't have to follow the rules. And so you
Right.
could see that conceptually, you could think of an extreme narcissist as really being the same as a psychopath. Psychopaths tend to be very narcissistic because they're only
Mhm.
thinking about themselves. So, as a quality, it does apply very well to psychopaths. So I think Ted Bundy was viewed as a psychopath, but he was clearly very narcissistic. Absolutely. And he thought he was the smartest guy in the room, and he liked to toy with the interrogators, and he would give them little teases because they wanted to know, who are all your victims? We want to close
Mhm.
cases. He would play with them, he would toy with them, um, for sure. He was
Now,
arrogant, he was highly arrogant.
what's the teasing? How is that an outlier of narcissism? Is it the control?
Yeah, it's just demonstrating your superiority.
Oh, got it. Okay.
And I mean,
Okay.
I have, I evaluate, people in prison or jail or just people who are psychopathic or antisocial, and they love to even the playing field. So I'm the psychiatrist. So I have perceived power, I have
Mhm.
knowledge, I have perceptions that based on my training and experience. So they want to fight back and kind of level the playing field and demonstrate you may think you're a hotshot, Dr. Cohen, but I'm superior to you. I'm smarter than you. I'm in control of this interview.
I have what you want. I have the information you want.
For sure. And I can
Yeah.
lead you on a goose chase. You think you're gonna diagnose me, but I can control this interview. You're not gonna get anywhere. I'm gonna stymie you.
Mhm.
And they take
Oh,
pleasure in that. And it's a type of sadism also, because it's
yes.
being sadistic towards the psychiatrist.
Right. No, people hear the word sadism and they immediately think physical torture, physical some sort of infliction of physical pain. Can sadism also involve psychological torture, psychological pain?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we see all types of versions of sadism, from the, what you would consider sort of passive, just being passive aggressive, that normal people do that. We all do that all the time. Someone might say, "Oh, I would love to have you over for dinner," and you say, "Oh, I'd really like that," but you actually really dislike the person, so you're sort of being passive aggressive, and then you just don't respond to their text message. There's a
Mhm.
little bit of sadism in that. You're kind of giving it
Right.
to them. And so we all have sadism that we deal with all the time.
Mhm.
And so it definitely though can come out in manipulation, in humiliating somebody, not necessarily physically, but just in how you deal with them.
Mhm.
And I think that power and power over others and humiliating others and rendering them helpless is a
Mm,
huge part of what intoxicates the sexual sadist, the
yep.
psychopathic killer like Ted Bundy and the BTK. He's getting off, right? He's literally I'm sorry, this sounds very graphic, but he's really masturbating over the corpse of somebody.
Mhm.
That's the ultimate expression of this person is completely powerless,
Right,
abject, a
right.
victim, and that turns him on. That's
Now,
intoxicating.
when, I've spoken to you, or at least I put it in the message about, Dr. Bricado and Dr. Burgess talking about the Idaho case and the cloak of darkness and the fear aspect. Does that desire to make someone fearful, make someone scared, is that part of the sadism? For that situation where someone goes into a house, it's dark, they're in bed, they're drunk, they don't have their, bearings. He is in such a position of power. That all could play into what he's getting from this, the pleasure he's getting from this, from scaring these people, not just from physically hurting them, but terrorizing them, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Now
I think for sure. Uh, and that's also interesting because that's a little different than what we see in the Luigi Mangione case, just looking at the video. So whoever that killer is,
mm,
he's not getting off on terrorizing his victim. His
right.
goal is to assassinate that person cleanly, quickly, almost really catching them unawares.
Mhm.
And so, to your point, if you're then thinking about, okay, who is that person in that video? Is that person a psychopath? You can kind of draw your conclusions. Well, they may have some psychopathic traits. They may be very narcissistic. They're not a sexual sadist.
Right.
They're not getting off on killing and blood and dominating the person.
Mhm.
That it's a different motivation.
I just wanna know what was going on in his head. What brought him to the what would make somebody with all this privilege, all these opportunities, why would he throw it away? That's what I really try to wrap my brain around because I think that's you have to factor that in. Why?
I think that's a really good question on the human level.
Mhm.
Almost sort of transcends forensic psychiatry and the legal analysis, psychiatric and legal analysis, and it just goes to the human dimension. And I think it's partly why I'm so fascinated by psychiatry because human behavior, there's a certain level at which it's unknowable.
Mhm.
And it's probably something that's really impossible to answer. He probably can't answer it, and his family and loved ones probably can't answer
Yeah.
why he would throw away his life.
Dr. Cohen, this has been so fascinating, such a great conversation, and to be able to talk about the 2 cases, but also the different aspects of it.
I really appreciate the chance to talk with you, and this has been absolutely fascinating and just an amazing session. And I look forward to sharing it with others because I think we covered a lot of kind of
Yep.
primary issues in forensics.
Mhm.
In terms of me, yeah, I'm on X. I'm on Instagram. I'm on TikTok. Sometimes I comment on things in the news or just interesting forensic issues. Folks are also welcome to visit our practice's website, principiumpsychiatry.com. They can read about psychedelic medicine on our website, ketamine therapy, TMS, lots of kind of cutting edge things happening in the world of neuroscience.
Our next conversation has to be about AI psychosis. That would be a fascinating topic to cover. Thank you so
I would love
much,
that.
Dr. Cohen. This was so insightful and just a great conversation, and I knew it would be. I didn't know it was gonna be this good.
Oh, your questions are so great. Seriously, so great, so incisive, so on topic, so informed, so knowledgeable. Absolute pleasure.
I'm going to put all of Dr. Cohen's socials in the show notes, so please make sure to follow him. This was a 90-minute interview. If you want to hear the bonus interview that I did with Dr. Cohen, make sure you're a subscriber of my Patreon. You can find it at patreon.com/mycharacteranalysis. If you're not following us on social media, what are you waiting for? We're on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok at My Character Analysis. And if you have a few seconds, please rate us 5 stars on Spotify and iTunes. Thank you so much for being listeners of this podcast. I'm really looking forward to 2026. Have a safe and happy holiday, and I'll talk to you guys soon.